Hello, everyone, and welcome to ReefStock at Home, episode 4. My name is Nicole, and I will be your host today for this episode about success with your first reef tank. Thank you, everyone. I can see people are just logging into the chat right now. Thank you for joining us today. I see we have people coming in from all over the world, which is awesome. We are just loving this new format of ReefStock at Home, where we can all connect at home, digitally, virtually. And today I've brought together some of my great friends in the hobby, and we're going to be bringing you a fantastic episode full of entertaining videos. And we're going to be here to help you answer your questions today. I see in the chat we got some familiar faces today. I saw Jay Wilson is there. Christopher Gentry is there. We got the Algae Warrior. We got Gabe's Reef Tampa. I see people are logging in on Facebook and YouTube. So thank you everyone who's joining us. And I see people are coming in from all over the world. So it's super exciting to be welcoming you today. My name is Nicole Helgeson, and I will be your host today. Jake Adams is off for this episode, but don't worry, we got a great lineup of speakers just waiting for you. And for those of you that don't know me, I've been actually working with the Reef Builders team since 2016. And so you might recognize my name from the blog. I've written a lot about topics about getting started in the hobby. So actually, when I was asked to host this episode of ReefStock, I thought, you know what? There's really no better topic that I can cover today than success with your first reef tank. And I know we have lots of people who are just getting started, or maybe they've only been keeping a reef tank for a year or a little bit more. And so today we're really going to be focused on giving you tips and the best solutions for how you can achieve success and keep your reef tank thriving, happy, and healthy. But I do see some of the pros here in the chat, and I want to just say, make sure you stick around because we do have some great guests today, and it's possible you're going to pick up some tips along the way. So, of course, we are here at ReefStock, and one reef stock would not be complete without some shiny new reef gear. And so we've got some great giveaways for you at the end of the show. So make sure you stick around till the end, where we have some Ecotech Radeon XR30 Pro lights to give away, as well as some Aquavitro Division protein skimmers. So I just want to know, I'm just going to check here. I know we have people signing in today from, I have Sunny Gold saying, hi, Nicole. We have Shane from Oregon. We have people from California, Texas, Switzerland. Let's see, we're going to go Tacoma, Washington, the UK, Cincinnati, New York, Indianapolis. We got the Czech Republic, Oregon. We have people from all over the world. We have the Netherlands. And I'm really curious to see how many people we can get in the chat today from all over the world. So thanks again for tuning in. And I think today what we're going to be doing, again, we're going to be talking about success with your first reef tank. And how we have it structured is we have 4 videos today, and they're all going to kind of build on themselves. And I've invited my friend Wendy Tam to give our first video on the topic of the different tank sizes. And so I know when you're in the forums or the chats or you're meeting anyone with the saltwater aquarium, the first question usually people ask is, what size tank should I get? And I know I've got a big 90-gallon behind me, but there's also some benefits and some reasons why you might want to choose a nano tank versus a larger tank. So I thought, it's what better topic? Let's get Wendy on here to give our video about the 4 fundamentals that you should know when choosing a reef tank.
Hey everybody, it's Wendy, and I was asked by my friend Nicole to talk to you today about what reef tank size I would choose and why. And I would say that there probably are 4 fundamental things that I would consider prior to purchasing a reef tank. The number one thing to consider is your budget, because let's face it, everyone has a different budget for what they envision their saltwater tank to be. There are a lot of things to consider. There's the tank itself, the livestock, the lighting, the movement of the water, the sump, the filtration, and all the new technologies that are available to us today. So now that we considered our budget and we know what we can afford, the next thing to consider is the space that you have for the saltwater tank. If you have 6 feet of space, then you definitely have a lot more options. Unlike, let's say, me, who has a 4 foot wall, and I still went with the 2 foot tank. The reasons being is that I'm in a hallway, it's off the living room, and I really wanted it to be nice and centered on my wall. And I also taped out the area to give myself a visual of how it would look in the area. There is a good old saying that you measure twice and cut once. So now that we've considered space, we need to think about the time that we're putting into our saltwater tank. Even with this 2 foot aquarium, I do a lot of maintenance, a lot of top offs due to the fact that there's more evaporation because of science. You may have a 6 foot tank and it may be a little bit more manageable when it comes to the swings and the stability, but there's also larger water changes to consider. I do go with a philosophy that you look 90% of the time and touch 10% of the time. So the last thing to tie everything together is do your research. We've looked into our budget, we measured our space, we considered the time that it takes to take care of our saltwater tank. So now we need to research the living beings that we're placing into our aquarium. We need to learn how to take care of them, to keep the longevity, have a successful tank, and make this an enjoyable experience for yourself. I hope you found this video informative, or maybe there are some things you didn't think of before and now you're thinking about now. I hope you found it beneficial. I wish that there were a few things that I would have known before I started my saltwater tank. But most importantly, I hope you're having fun on your saltwater adventure. Hey everybody.
Wendy, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having
I'm
me.
it's so great to see you. It's so great to connect. And, even though we're at home, it's just so awesome to be able to see you and connect and chat about reef tanks for a while.
Yes, it is. And having everyone here in the comments and interacting, it's been really awesome to see. And it's just funny sometimes to see yourself in video and see it play back.
Yeah, I know. One of the things I really miss about ReefStock is just connecting with my friends. So I know if we were at ReefStock together, we would definitely be hanging out. We've been friends for quite a while, so I'm sure we could sit here and chat forever. But thank you again for making that video and bringing up those four really important topics. You called them the four fundamentals of choosing a tank. And I know we have a bunch of people in the comments here. And one of the first tips that you had was budget. Even though you can get a bigger tank, maybe you shouldn't, and maybe you should consider your budget. And I know the smaller tank helps keep down the budget. So, do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, just to elaborate on budget, even though my budget, I probably could have gotten a larger tank, but I needed to stay within the space that I had, which was a 4 foot wall. It's in an area that kind of gets a lot of traffic. It's in the living room. So I know in the future I want to be able to upgrade. So that kind of paves the way on how I want to scape or place my rock work and what equipment I want to pick in the future. Ultimately, I went with a budget friendly 2 foot tank that worked for me. I was going to have it as a freshwater setup, but I, like yourself, ended up drilling the tank so I could have a reef tank. And that kind of leads me into other great alternatives for finding your first reef tank or starting a reef tank, like looking into either holiday sales, supporting your local fish store, going online, doing that research. And also, I found that Facebook and groups are really great places for us to get information and meet new people and find possibly used equipment that could work for our setups.
Yeah, you're totally right. There's so many people that are kind of just looking to get into the hobby and they assume that it's going to cost so much money, but there's always a way to set up a tank. Like mine, I adopted my tank just like you're saying, and I got a great deal on it. The plan was always to upgrade it, but I still, it's just,
Always.
I felt so good about adopting the corals. And you're right. If you get that smaller tank, you can only really put the one light and all so many fish in it. And you also touched on space. And that's a great point that you make for when people are getting a tank. And I think that when they kind of have this question, oh, should I get a bigger one or a smaller one? And people always come back with the comments, well, of course, a bigger one is better. It's easier to keep stable over time, and you might have to spend more time with the nano tank perfecting all the little the salinity and all the parameters. But that's a great point. And we were talking about this earlier. Is last year I actually set up a nano tank for my mom, and it's an 8-gallon tank. She didn't have any experience keeping saltwater tanks, and she's had it for almost a year, and she's doing great. And one of the reasons is I know she has a lot of time on her hands to take care of it. So that was another tip you brought up is maybe in your decision of choosing a bigger or smaller tank, you want to consider the budget and, of course, the space where you're going to put it and how much time you have to dedicate to it. And so, how much time do you think it takes you to take care of your tank?
I like to do about weekly water changes, and I do apply that 90% look, 10% touch aspect to it. So I do love to view my tank every day. So then I take that opportunity to kind of check everything out, make sure everything's happy. I do feed every day, so there's a lot of aspects that you can put into it. Going back onto space, I when I was drilling and everything, I really wanted kind of like a low profile. I went with silicone tubing, which may not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was definitely easy for me to place that along the wall that I had. But I try not to put too much time into it because I know it'll probably drive me a little crazy if I am always there tinkering with something or doing something. But I'm lucky enough to work in the industry.
Right.
So I'm fortunate to work with Coral View, and that lends a lot of time to give to my tank because my hobby and my career are kind of in one. It's sort of like this tank lifestyle. But
Yeah.
I'm continually gaining a lot of knowledge, and it really helps, at least for me, when your partner is also very involved in your hobby
Right.
as well. So
Yeah.
I have a lot of people to lean on to kind of help me. But yeah,
Yeah, and I think definitely when you have a bigger tank, you're going to spend more time taking care of it.
yes.
And so
Well,
we
I
have
have a
that
lot of
last
other
question.
tanks that are clearly behind me that are bigger than my reef tank, but we have multiple small ones. Those also take time too.
And so I know you have a second video for us here and more about your current setup. So I wonder if we can just head over to that one and then go from there.
Sure. Now that we went over the 4 fundamentals that I think you should definitely consider prior to purchasing your first reef tank, I want to chat about what I'm currently keeping and why I have those livestock and why I chose certain things for my build. I started with a 24 by 18 by 18 glass box that wasn't outfitted to be a reef tank. However, they do make kits out there, and I did get a eShop's Prodigy Slimline Overflow box to drill and add to this tank. That kit came with everything that I needed, including the diamond bit drill, and that was a fun first time experience to drilling anything that involves glass. So a tip to keep in mind is to have plumber's putty. That was really essential to keeping the water centralized in the area that I was drilling, so that made it a lot easier to drill the tank. As far as livestock goes, I'm only working with about 30 to 40 gallons. You do need to consider your rock work and substrate. That will also displace some water. With my Rockscape, I made sure to add some caves because I do have a cave basslet and a fire shrimp, as well as 2 clowns. One is a nearly naked and the other is a Da Vinci. As far as coral placement, I wanted to have a Zoa garden that was separate from the arches, so I placed the Zoa gardens in the front here. And the Recordia, the mushrooms, are along the sand bed in the front. And my Euphyllia, like your hammers or frog spawn and torches, do need more flow, so they're at the higher parts of the arches, so they're really happy there. And I do have some rock flower anemones that I first started with in my 16-gallon all-in-one. They're pretty hardy coral to keep. They're colorful. They're really fun to watch, but they do like to move around on you, I've come to learn. I also have a really good group of cleanup crew that includes hermit crabs, emerald crabs, and your snails. I do have turbo snails and a conch snail. I do have a porcelain crab that's in here. He actually just molted, and he's been chasing the bubble tip anemone that I have. And so far, the bubble tip anemone hasn't found its perfect place yet in this tank. It tends to move every couple of days, so it's kind of a fun game for me to try to find it the next day. I also have random place rocks with chalices on them, because ultimately the goal is to have them cover that entire rock. It's nice to have separate little pieces, so when I do decide to upgrade my tank, I'll be able to move that scape a lot more easier instead of having everything attached. I currently have a light that more than likely I'll be able to transfer to a larger tank. So I did choose a light that does have the capabilities of growing with me. I hope you enjoyed taking a glimpse into my reef tank. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you gathered some helpful information and, most importantly, inspiration. See you guys soon. It also helps when you have a partner that does all the work for you.
Right.
Wendy, thanks. I had to laugh so hard at that video when you said you have a game every day to look for your anemone, because I have to do the same thing.
Yep.
So I'm
And
glad
I
I'm
freak
not the
out
only one.
constantly. I'm like, where'd it go?
And they like to go up into a little ball. Sometimes you can't even see them.
Yeah.
So I was just reading some of the comments here while we were watching your videos, and it seems there's quite a few people. I saw like Chris Gentry here is at home. He's doing his tank maintenance at the moment. Reef the Sea Forever is doing a water change right now, and we're trying to see. James is also at home doing maintenance on his house pipes and drywall this week. So it seems like your video is just coming in the perfect time, because we have so many people in the chat. Another teen reefing is here doing a water change and dosing the tank. So I guess this is a good thing. Saturday can be the day for doing your tank maintenance and watching ReefStock and connecting
I
at
like
home.
that. That'll probably motivate me more too if I know that others are doing the same thing with me.
Right. Yeah. Someone says here that looks like I'm hoarding all the Versa pumps in the background. Not hoarding them. I just got a little stash. First time Reefer TV is in the chat. David Mai from Australia. We also have Lam Doan from Australia. All the Aussies are representing. I think they're waiting for Anya, who's coming up next. Lots of people in the chat. Skimmer needs emptying. Reef KP says he's going to be emptying his skimmer. Hopefully it's not too smelly today, but that's always a good
Mine was
thing.
pretty full in that video. I was like, oh, should have
It's
cleaned that up
okay.
a bit, but it's real life.
Yeah, I know maintenance is definitely part about keeping a tank. And I think one of the things that we were talking about before is research. I mean, researching your tank ahead of time is super important, and taking into consideration these factors about maintenance. How long is it going to take you to take care of your tank? Do you have the time? So can you just tell us a little bit more about why it's important to do your research before picking out a tank?
Yeah, so your fish and coral longevity, I believe, will be very reliant on taking the time to research them. Your livestock will most likely flourish if you can kind of replicate a natural habitat for them, either whether it be like caves, your rock work, your lighting, the placement of your coral if you do decide to add coral, and how much stock that you're putting in your tank. As much as I love that 1 inch fish, it will fit in my tank right now, but in the long term, will it be a really good environment for them later on?
For sure. And, that's one of the things that I always say to people too, is they ask, what size tank should I get? And I say, well, what do you want to get? What's your priority? What's your preference of what you want to keep in the tank?
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit there.
No worries. Yeah, it's great. I mean, so anyways, I think it's so awesome. Thank you so much for coming by. I'm just reading all the comments again here. I think people are really enjoying our stream today. They're giving us some support for the ladies in the chat, which is awesome. Nice to see the Blue Reef says, nice to see the women in the hobby. MB Reef says, hi, Nikki. We have some people saying hi to Wendy. More people doing maintenance.
That seems like the theme for today. So I'm glad we're keeping everyone company while they're cleaning their tanks and whatnot. And, just to elaborate on growing with your hobby, I'm not, and on the end of my video, I was talking about a light that I chose, which was the Kessel AP9X LED. And that right now is, I can grow with that because I believe the coverage goes up to like 48 inches or something like that. So that's something I want to be able to upgrade with later. So there's lots of options on equipment that you can grow with to help with time and give Jay a break from doing all my work for me. So I'm actually starting to dabble into controllers. And with all the new technologies, it kind of makes that possible for us to help with our time and our time maintenance. And eventually for me, I definitely need to introduce an automatic top off like system, an ATO or something like that. With my controller, which I'm hoping to jump into hydros, and it'll help me with all my evaporation issues and all that. So
I know, and I was thinking the same thing too about my power heads. Is I really love to have these new power heads that are controllable, because there's some places in the back of my tank where I'd love to have a power head, but the power is just too high right now. So I think, taking the time to invest in the quality equipment that, like you said, you can grow with and that has a controllable function, you're just going to get that much more use out of it. So I really appreciate that, you saying that as well. So I think we've covered that. I mean, I think that's a really important question. If you're just starting out and you want to be successful, do your research, plan ahead, think, what do you want to get? Do you want a species specific tank? Is it really a seahorse that you want to get? Or are you looking to get these predator fish? Or are you just interested in coral? And maybe plan your tank and your habitats around this. Or if you just want to get a nano tank because it fits perfectly in your space, then research the corals and the livestock that will fit into your environment. And when you're looking at it like in that way, like it's a whole contained environment, I think overall it's going to lead to your ongoing and continued success. So thank you so much, Wendy. I know we'll be seeing you later. You're going to come back in the show. But right now, we have our favorite Aussie reefer, well, maybe my favorite Aussie reefer, Anya from Gallery Aquatica, who's bringing us 2 great videos about our next topic in the show, which is how to cycle your aquarium, how to build biology in your aquarium, and then accuracy in water testing. So stay tuned for those videos coming up next.
G'day reefers, I'm Anya and welcome to ReefStock at Home. Thank you so much to Reef Builders for giving me this amazing opportunity of being part of the show. Today, we're at Gallery Aquatica and I'm going to share with you my top 10 tips and tricks for successfully cycling your aquarium. So part of the initial challenges that reefers encounter when they're setting up a new tank is going through the nitrogen cycle. And cycling the tank is actually a process whereby you're establishing beneficial bacteria cultures in your substrate, media, in your filtration, and in your rock work, which is responsible for assimilating the waste products which are created by the fish and coral. So you can see here in this very generalized diagram, the fish are producing waste, which turns into ammonia, then bacteria responsible, because the ammonia is very toxic, it's very undesirable. The bacteria then converts ammonia to nitrite, which is far less toxic in marine tanks. Then you're waiting on a second type of bacteria to convert it to nitrate, which is then uptaken by plants, algae, plankton, which in turn eaten by the fish, creating that beautiful closed ecosystem. But sometimes it doesn't quite go much like the textbook suggests. So here's my first tip. Tip number 1, choose biological media with the highest surface area to volume ratio that you can afford. Now, with the goal in mind of growing as much of this beneficial bacteria as possible to break down your waste, by providing media that is highly porous, or thereby has a high surface area to volume ratio, you're going to be able to grow a huge amount of good bacteria to break down your waste. Ensure, whichever media you choose, that it is well positioned within your sump so that water has a great flow through and not just bypasses the media. And also, while we're on the topic, never, ever, ever wash it. Tip number 2. Now, while the nitrifying bacteria is naturally occurring in marine ecosystems, it is of huge benefit if you're able to add a commercially pre-packaged bacteria product. Now, it's really important to note the difference between a live bacteria culture and a dormant bacteria culture. The dormant bacteria culture is basically going to take a little bit longer to start to wake up and multiply and get your cycle going, whereas the live bacteria is ready to go. When you get your bacteria, make sure you follow the instructions and tip it over your biological media to ensure that it's going straight into its desirable new home. Tip number 3, wet balls. Why not consider some pre-seeded media, which you can usually find at your favorite LFS or even get some from a reefing friend. Just be sure when you're going to bag up said wet balls that you're doing it completely underwater and not taking them out of the water so as not to disturb the very important beneficial bacteria colonies when you take them home and let them seed your sterile filtration. Tip number 4, keep your protein skimmer and UV sterilizer turned off throughout the entire duration of the cycle. Your protein skimmer could potentially skim out some of the waterborne bacteria, whereas the UV sterilizer, well, that's just going to zap it. Tip number 5, add an ammonia source. The population of bacteria actually is completely determined by the level of ammonia that they have available to consume. So whether you choose to add a nice clean ammonium chloride solution or the old school method of adding some fish food to rot every day, make sure you're adding the ammonia source right in the same place that you have your high surface area to volume ratio biological media. Tip number 6, test, test, test. And don't forget to log your results. So it's important to note that some of the test kits that you use to track how well your cycle's going are actually likely to never be used again. But the information is so powerful in determining how efficiently your tank is cycling and also in estimating when it could be safe to next add some livestock. So let's just take a quick look. We've got number of days and potential level. And so the first thing you see, the ammonia will go up, usually between 1 and 2 parts per million if it's all going swimmingly. And by about day 8 to 12, you've grown enough beneficial bacteria to break that ammonia back down. So you get this peak. At exactly the same time, it turns into nitrite. So then the nitrite will go up around about day 18 to 21, and then it turns back around and you get the second peak. So once you've then grown this second type of bacteria, all the waste will be turned into nitrate, which one means your tank has undergone its first cycle successfully, and 2, it's probably a great time to add some livestock. Tip number 7, make an appropriate first fish choice. Now, fish will contribute to the cycle by producing the waste products which are going to feed your beneficial bacteria. And Historically, we would use damsels and chromis not just because they're cheap, but because of their hardiness and ability to tolerate these excessively high nitrogenous waste levels. So the modern reef keeper is got the best option possible, and they are clownfish. Not only are they hardy, they're desirable and they're sustainable because they're aquacultured. Tip number 8. When you're adding your cleanup crew, be sure to add it at the right time. So everybody likes to increase their biological diversity, especially if you've been staring at a tank with rockwork for nearly 4 weeks. However, make sure if you're going to buy herbivores that you have not only nuisance algae for them to eat, but the right species of algae. What may be a smarter choice is to use things like Nazarius snails or omnivores, whereby you're able to supplement their diet with pellets or pre-prepared foods. Tip number 9. It's best to wait till the very end of your cycle before you set up your refugium or an algae turf scrubber. So the benefits of Ketomorpha are great. However, if you add it too early, you can get some uptake of your ammonia and nitrite, which ends up falsifying your test results, and you don't get to see those peaks and troughs, which really prove that your aquarium is capable of growing the beneficial bacteria required to assimilate the livestock's waste. At that point, once you've got a refugium set up, it's a great idea to increase your microflora biodiversity by adding copepods, rotifers, and even phytoplankton. Tip number 10, be patient. Please remember, cycled does not mean matured. The types of livestock you add in the first stages of your aquarium being set up have to be well thought out. At Gallery Aquatica, for example, we suggest you don't add any LPS or SPS until you feel far more comfortable with all the water testing and you've proven some stability in your reef ecosystem. A lot of corals really require a very well matured, stable environment, and for this reason it's just so important to just be patient, because I promise your patience will pay off. Thank you so much for joining me here today at Gallery Aquatica as we shared our top 10 tips for cycle success. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them below. I hope you enjoy the rest of today's show. Happy reefing! G'day reefers! Welcome to Gallery Aquatica TV. I'm Anya, and today we're in store and we're going to share with you some tips and tricks on how to get the most accurate results from your testing procedure. So as I'm sure you're well aware, so many of the invertebrates like coral, shrimp, sea stars that we keep in our reef aquariums depend on very good water chemistry. It is for this reason that we test our water so diligently and wherever possible improve the accuracy of the results. So tip number 1, irrespective of what test kit brand you choose, it's very important to always check the expiry date. So tip number 2, reduce all forms of potential contamination. When you're taking the sample from your main aquarium, you want to use a vessel that you've actually rinsed in the sample, discarded, and then you actually take enough water that you're able to rinse all the vials you'll be using, the lids that are going onto the vials, and the pipettes as well. This ensures there's no potential residual contaminants and you're going to get the most accurate result possible. Tip number 3, particularly if you're using some old vials that you've used multiple times before, you may find that the fill line has wiped away a little bit. So it can be very useful to get yourself a medical grade syringe and ensure that 5 ml actually is indeed 5 ml. Tip number 4, know your meniscus. So when you're filling the vial with your water sample, what you will find is that the surface of the water actually has a slight bend to it. Now, it is called the meniscus, or the surface or skin of the water, if you like, and you really need to get on eye level to ensure that it is the bottom curvature of the meniscus that is lining up with the fill line on the vial. Tip number 5, be sure to read your test kit instructions very thoroughly. You can even use a highlighter to highlight the most important points. Examples that can be easily overlooked in the steps are things like placing a cap on top of your test vial or shaking instead of swirling. Another one we hear about often is viewing the color side on when it should actually be viewed top down. Tip number 6, use a timing device such as a mobile phone wherever is necessary. The chemical reactions that are occurring within the vial rely on this timing to be as accurate as possible to provide you the right result. Tip number 7, make sure when you're doing repeat testing that you're taking the sample at a very similar time of day. Another important thing to consider is to ensure you're not taking the water sample shortly after feeding your fish, and certainly not after feeding your coral. Tip number 8, repeat the test multiple times on the same sample and use a calculator to work out the average value. This will eliminate any potential discrepancies in the testing procedure. Tip number 9, when in doubt, it can be really useful to cross-reference your results with someone else's. Your local fish store is the perfect place to take your water sample and your results and get them to check it and see if you come up with the same number. Our final tip for today on improving the accuracy of your test results is to make sure you're buying the right test kits for the resolution that you wish to achieve. What this means is some kits have a resolution of say 20 parts per million. Others have a resolution of 5 parts per million. If you require higher accuracy than that, then why not go for one that has a 1 part per million resolution, such as a HANA instrument? Or failing that, the most accurate option is, of course, cross-checking your results against an ICP test. So there you have it. 10 basic tips on how to improve the accuracy of your water testing regime. If you've got any suggestions or anything to add, please be sure to leave me a comment below. I'd love to answer and hear your opinions. Thanks for joining me on today's episode of Gallery Aquatica TV. I'm Anya, and happy reefing.
That's our video for today.
Anya, how are you doing?
Morning, everyone.
Yeah, it's the morning for you there over in Australia. How are you? I haven't seen you in a while. It's so nice to connect like this.
Amazing seeing you. Thank you so much for having me here today.
How could I not, Anya? Have you been checking out the chat? Everyone is going crazy. They love you. You know, people are saying you have so much enthusiasm that they're tired just watching you. So it's so exciting to have you. I'm so happy to have you because you're one of my favorite people, and I absolutely love your videos, and I think they're really important, and they do a really good job of explaining all these topics for success with your reef tank. So thank you again for giving us those videos. And I just wanted to say, we've got a lot of great comments coming in here, talking about cycling and testing. So yeah, how are you doing? And what do you want to tell us about those videos?
I'm going great, thanks. I guess I find it really difficult because in real life I tend to waffle and I do talk fairly fast, but having been in the aquarium industry professionally for over 20 years now, these kinds of spiels are things that have been formulated over time, and we generalize to make it punctual and short, and try to make it as simple as possible so that new hobbyists especially are not befuddled by the entire concept of maintaining this ecosystem in a glass box. But
Right.
when you really start to tease it out, there are all kinds of possibilities, and alternatives and options. And so um, I enjoy the challenge of doing these like short, punchy kind of here are the main points videos.
I love your videos. And I know we just had Wendy's video before you. And I was saying one of the first questions that people often ask when they're getting into the hobby is what size tank to have. And then they get to that point where, okay, you've decided which tank is going to work best and maybe which species you want to get. And then the next thing that happens is you need to cycle your aquarium. So I know you had some great tips in that video. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with those tips and why they're so important?
Oh, sure. Well, when I was asked to be on the show and you mentioned this topic about startup success, I thought, well, this was going to be something that I've never covered before, but it's always been on my mind. So I thought it was going to be a really good idea to interview each member of our team at Gallery Aquatica and ask them what their most important priorities were when trying to
Great idea.
reefer with cycling their aquarium, and not just the information of what is a cycle, but how to make it work more efficiently, or how to be capable to troubleshoot if it's not happening like you expected or like the textbook suggested. So a lot of these tips, when I hear them back, I think of the staff member that put it forward as their most important priority. So it was kind of like a nice team building exercise as well, and just to make sure that everyone on our team is kind of really all on the same page as well, which, misinformation is one thing, but having too much conflicting information is also very confusing for a new hobbyist. And so we all really need to be on a similar kind of understanding.
Right. And I saw some of the comments coming in, and there was a really great one from Chris C. And he said the bacteria population cannot be overlooked. And I think that's really important, is that when you're starting your cycle, you're really developing those bacteria populations that are going to maintain your tank over time. So it's more than just getting the cycle done and over with. Okay, everything's done. You're actually working to build and maintain that population. And one of the comments that I think you were saying was, you have to wait to add your cleanup crew. And we had another one in here about the cleanup crew. You have to wait to add the cleanup crew before they have something to eat. So can you tell us a little bit about that, when someone's going through the cycling process and then they're ready to add their cleanup crew?
So I really understand that it's very hard looking at a box with rock and nothing else, or just potentially your initial cycling fish. And it's often recommended to start getting some cleanup crew quite early on, or people just do it anyway. And I think the thing to remember, these cleanup crew need to eat, and it's their number one job in their ecological role to just eat and eat. And a lot of these new tanks are quite sterile, especially the modern reefing setups with that we're not using live rock anymore, and a lot of people are doing bare bottom as well. So
Yeah.
it's inappropriate to put in something that requires substrate, for example, like a Nasarius snail, that they really need that organic matter decomposing, and sand-seeking starfish. But
Yeah.
that tip was actually from Cameron. So he said it was really important to not just think I need a herbivore when I have algae, but to really get the right herbivore. A diadema urchin has a different kind of a diet to a strombus snail. So it's just
Obviously. I don't know. You're the expert here, but that's such a great tip. And I think you were saying before is that, patience is obviously key. We all know that when we're keeping an aquarium, that patience is key. But especially when you're first starting out, the best way to be successful is to hold off, be patient, and add everything little by little. So add your cleanup crew, then add your fish slowly. And it kind of goes back to that point about what Wendy was saying about research. I mean, this is so important. So you have those great tips about cycling, and I think it really ties into nicely. You had already put out that video about testing, which I loved, because when I got into my tank, I realized that I had to start really getting in depth. I had to start really digging in to testing, and you have some great tips in there. And so I think let's just touch on a little bit about, when you're doing your cycle, you need to test to make sure it's done. And then what are some tips for making sure that these are accurate?
Tips for making sure that the testing is accurate.
Yeah, like you gave us all those tips for accuracy, like what are some tips for accuracy, and how can you test for to know that your cycle is ready to go?
I think the main thing is really just making sure that you're testing that nitrate, and because the nitrate is evidence that the bacteria has been present to convert the waste levels through ammonia and nitrite. You can probably get away without the nitrite kit if you understand what's happening and you just do ammonia and nitrate. But I think people also need to understand that each time you change your biological waste load, your bacteria is going to have to multiply to compensate for that increase in waste. And so it's not that your tank is cycling every month, but you will get an ammonia spike if you add too much livestock with each kind of addition. And so I think when it comes down to it, like achieving that ultimate stability, it's all about patience. It's all sort of entwined, but doing small things at a time. Yeah.
Yeah, patience is definitely key. I see we have a lot of people coming into the chat now, asking, obviously complimenting you, that you're amazing, and that's why I definitely wanted to have you on. Hello, Anya, Team Reefing. Everyone's commenting here. Carrie Apollo TV. Hello, Anya. Anya is the best. Keith Bradley. So many great points coming from Anya here. We got Luis Heredia in the chat. I know he was one of our winners from last episode. People are talking about their different test kits that they use, and diversity. This is a good one. Kevin Wisen says diversity of multiple bacteria is key. And I think that's something that, like you say, builds up over time. Every new fish introduces new bacteria and new diversity to our tank, and it's something that we need to be aware of. And I think this is key for this subject, about continued success, keeping your tanks going. We want to get reefers past that first year, that first 6 months. And what kind of tips do you have for people like that who are just starting out, and maybe they've done their cycle, they have their reef tank going for 6 months? How can they continue to be successful?
Well, I guess never have to just keep on learning, keep on engaging with members of the community. And, there are things like Facebook groups, but there are clubs and people that you will meet at your LFS that may have a different take on something that is worthwhile kind of taking on lots of people's opinions based on their experience. And then once you feel more confident at that 6-month point, you can probably start to practice a couple of things and find out what is your best, method. Whereas in the beginning, you kind of like blind, especially if you haven't been in a freshwater aquarist before. And some of our best clients have never had a freshwater tank, so I don't think you have to do that. But I think that the 6 months, at 6 months, you're really starting to approach something that's much more mature, and you'll actually be able to breathe easier because everything, you feel more comfortable with testing. And even then, all these alien creatures like the coral polyps, you start to get to know your own tank. I know it sounds really unscientific, but I can walk into the shop and see straight away if the magnesium ratio to calcium ratio is out of ratio. I know if the potassium level is under 400 parts per million just from looking at the corals. It doesn't. We always back it up with testing, but you start to get to really know your system a lot better and feel more comfortable with like experimentation, but also formulating your own kind of method.
Yeah, observation. I'm hearing observation is key. And I know we have a couple questions here. You'd mentioned keeping those bio blocks in the tank. And when would you recommend replacing something like that?
Oh, now some media it does actually degrade over time, and that is likely to be probably because of the buildup of carbonic acids, like slowly degrading, like breaking that media down. And so I think if it were that you're using, like if your tank is 5 to 10 years old and you're finding your biological media start to break down, the best solution would be to place a brand new one of equal capacity right next to it. And then I wouldn't suggest to remove it until you're feeling very confident that a lot of that bacteria has transferred, and also not to really remove anything that you're relying on for biological capacity at the
Right.
same time as like don't gravel back your tank and do a giant water change at the same time as cleaning all your filter soft sponges and then turfing out some concentration without expecting an spike. So there's always things you can do. You can buy ammo lock, or you can get a more bacterial culture, or wet balls.
Stability. Wet balls. Yeah, I got to keep them wet. Keep the bacteria alive, right? That's why you keep them wet, to keep the bacteria alive. And I think that's really key, is like stability over time. I know I just went through a big upgrade with my tank, and that's something that we're going to be showing in the next video. And it's tough. It's tough to keep things stable. I've got these new dosing pumps that I'm about to hook up. And before, when I was just hand dosing the tank, it's so hard to keep things stable. And I think that's really the key, like you said, for any new aquarist. Just observation, do your research, and try to keep things stable. And so that's really for the first year, even the first 2 years. It's really, the basics of when you're just going to get started. I know we've got a couple more comments in the chat. I know a lot of people here are talking about the NIOS test kits, which is one of the sponsors for our show today. So thank you, NIOS. People are loving their nitrate test kits, and they say look at that. Yeah, we didn't even.
Thank you for my morning coffee.
There you go. NIOS prefer giving the coffee. People saying Diggy Reefs saying I don't skimp on test kits, and maybe just one of the last things people here are going more advanced with the Alkatronic. I know that's one of the more advanced testing methods for alkalinity in their tank, but lots of people here saying it's important to do regular testing. I know that when I was just getting started, I was testing every single day, and I'm down to about 3 days a week. How often do you test?
To be 100% honest, we do our testing once a week, and not something that I am proud of. It is just simply the fact that it is just so busy, and we have so many crops and fish and clients to look after between the propagation facility, the store. We're opening a second store at the moment, and also we have our clientele. So we have so much going on. And like I'm saying, that experience of that, not just myself, but everyone on our team, is a highly professional, long-term aquarist experience. Is key to being able to identify straight away something's wrong, and of course, if something wrong, we will test.
You can almost talk to your corals. I don't know. I talk to my corals. I'm assuming you probably do too.
Yeah.
And for those of you that are just tuning in that maybe don't know Anya actually runs a great local fish store in Wynnum, Australia. It's close to Brisbane. So if you're one of the lucky few that's living out there by Brisbane or anywhere in the vicinity, make sure to go check them out, because it is a fantastic local fish store with great advice. They have a YouTube channel, and you can just go into their store and get some new corals, and you know that you're going to get trustworthy advice. And that's so awesome for any new aquarist and success, is find a local fish store by your house, and maybe ask them questions, see what they're saying. Like you said, go into the chats, go into the Facebook groups, and ask questions. But you really got to find some knowledgeable aquarist like yourself and rely on that person for some trustworthy advice, because like patience is key. And I think aquariums are a long-term success. And so the longer you're in the hobby, the more advice that you get, the more questions that you're going to have. I'm sure that things come up for even you, Anya, where, you're, what's that? And what do I do?
We've never been so lucky as aquarists to have so much research available and so many resources available for information. And so there's really no excuse to not share this information, and to really take it on board, because 20 years ago we knew so little compared to today, and these advances have only made reef keeping more interesting and easier. So
Right. And that's what I was saying before too. I mean, I'm actually a writer for Reef Builders. You might have read some of my blog articles on Reef Builders, and a lot of them, every single one. Thank you, Anya. I've watched every single one of your videos, so don't worry. But I always try to provide the most accurate information for people getting started, because I think it's so important. We want to make sure people have that success and they continue on in the hobby, because there's so much more in it than just getting started. So thank you again, Anya. Let's go back to the chat. I'll stay here. Everyone loves you. We got the gallery rocks from Anthony Page. I guess he's probably one of your customers, because he says he is over there, and the gallery rocks. It's true. I've been there. Gregor Stephen says Gallery Aquatica rules. It's a gathering place. So hopefully everyone can find a local fish store near them that becomes that gathering place. Let's see. I mean, do you have any more tips for all the people out there? We've got some questions coming in. Let's see. Lou Reef says, great to see Reef Hobby reaching out to grow their base. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that everyone is successful, and we're here for you. Blue Reef, I wish I had an LF store like yours near me. Jody Haylock, hi ladies from Newcastle, Australia. And Carrie Apollo Ashcroft TV, nice to have women reefers on today. Thank you so much for tuning in. And yeah, do you have anything else you want to say for everyone watching us?
Just thank you so much for having me. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel if you would like any more information, or to watch some of our aquarium builds. It's quite entertaining. But
It is.
I really appreciate the opportunity to share our team's knowledge with you today.
For sure. And if you guys have any questions for Anya or Wendy in the chat, we're going to go to my video next, which is updating your Aquascape, which is the next step, something you might want to do after you've set up your tank. And then we're going to be coming back with Anya and Wendy to answer all your questions in the chat. So stay tuned. Hi, everyone. It's me again. And I hope you're enjoying this episode of ReefStock at Home, Success with Your First Reef Tank. And actually, I'm here with my first reef tank, so I'm super excited to be bringing you this video about updating your Aquascape, because you know what that means? My tank is gonna be getting an upgrade this weekend, and I couldn't be more excited. So I actually bought this tank last year, and when I got it, it was already 7 years old. And when I saw pictures of it, I saw this bubble coral, and I thought, that's it, I need to have this tank. But when I got it, I knew that it was gonna need some upgrades, because it's just a simple saltwater tank, and that's fine. I was excited about doing the upgrades. And one of the big upgrades that we're doing to this tank is we're gonna be adding a sump. And when I picked up the sump, I realized, you know what? I'm gonna need to drain all the water and take out all the rocks to be able to fit the sump inside the stand. And so it came to my mind, well, if I wanna change the Aquascape, if I wanna upgrade the Aquascape at all, now is the time. No time like the present. So here we are. We're about to take on this project of upgrading the Aquascape. Our Aquascape right now is kind of just a precarious rock pile, and the rocks are just kind of balancing on top of each other. And we've tried our best to create a little bit of caves and some separation and some hiding spaces and open places, but we're kind of just stuck with what we have. And so that's why we're planning this project to upgrade. Because you know what, nowadays there's so many great options available to us for shapes and arches and shaped rocks that we can use in our Aquascape. So why not use some of those new rocks to upgrade what we already have? Now, this episode of ReefStock is all about success with your first reef tank. So if you've already done your aquascape ahead of time, you might not even need to follow these steps. But if you're like me and you adopted a tank, or you set up your tank and you're just not that happy with your aquascape, this is something that you might have to do. And I've come up with 4 reasons that anyone would want to upgrade their aquascape, whether they're just starting out or whether you've had your tank for a while. And I think the number 1 reason we can all agree that you'd want to upgrade your aquascape is for improved flow. And what that means is you want to make sure you have enough open spaces where all the water can circulate. And if that means adding a second pump, that's something you want to do. But you want to make sure there isn't a big rock pile like we have where you're not getting any flow. Sometimes we find in the back of our aquascape here, we're kind of lacking a little bit of flow. So the idea for our upgrade is kind of to take out some of those big chunky rocks and, maybe add a little bit more height to the tank where we can get more flow. Reason number 2 why you might want to upgrade your aquascape is for more real estate. I love corals just as much as anyone, and this aquascape is kind of lacking in real estate. There's a lot of corals that I want to add, and I just don't have the space to add them. So one thing that I'm really looking forward to with our new aquascape is some open spaces to add corals. So reason number 3 that you might want to upgrade your aquascape is stability. As I mentioned before, these rocks are really precarious. They're really just stacked on top of each other. And if you want to make any movement, you risk an avalanche. And so you might want to upgrade your aquascape for that reason. And upgrading your aquascape could mean just adding some epoxy or some glue between these rocks to make sure that you have a strong foundation and a stable aquascape. Reason number 4 that you might want to upgrade your aquascape is aesthetics. Let's face it, all we do is look at this aquarium, so we really want to make sure it looks good. We want to make sure that it sparks joy, that it makes you feel happy when you look at it. And right now, we love our tank, but we know that it could be better. And so we are going to be upgrading it for those reasons, to make it more aesthetic, more beautiful, more pleasing to the eye. So now that we've gone over some reasons why you might want to upgrade your aquascape, I think it's time we get to the nitty-gritty of what we're going to be doing to upgrade ours. And as I mentioned before, one of the main reasons why we bought this tank was for this big, beautiful bubble coral. And in our aquascape right now, it's got a pretty nice spot. We call it the cleaning station. You have the little shrimp that hang out here on the bottom, but the bubble coral gets really big during the day, and it's almost impossible to move this magnet and clean the glass next to it. So one of the things we're prioritizing with our aquascape is to move the bubble coral so we have more space. After we find the perfect home for our bubble coral, another thing we want to do is remove some of these bigger, bulkier rocks and replace them with these beautiful arches from Carib Sea. I actually picked up a box of these and I'm so excited to be installing them in the tank. They all kind of fit together and they have these little holes in there that we can put the corals in, and I think it's going to give us some nice dimension and height to the tank. While I really think it's important to plan ahead when you're doing your aquascape, and I have my priorities of what I want to get out of our aquascape, there's really no telling what's going to happen once we get everything out of the tank and start mixing the old rocks with the new rocks. So at one point, we're just going to have to go with the flow and see what we get. And I think it's about time that we start draining the tank. We've gone ahead and taken all the water and rocks out of the tank. And what we've done is we've added all the rocks with coral in this bucket. It's about 50 gallons. And in this one, we have all the fish and rocks. And I've done that because we're about to mix the old rocks with new rocks. And every time I go to grab a coral or a rock, I don't really want to be disturbing the fish. And to make sure everything stays nice and stable, we've added a power head and a heater to both bins and a digital thermometer to keep an eye on everyone. My idea for this aquascape is we kind of want to make 2 little islands. So what I'm thinking is building 2 little sections here with these arc rocks and putting them on top of my older rocks. But before I get all the wet rocks out of the water, I'm just gonna play around with these rocks for a bit and see how the arches fit together. I've played with the rocks for a little bit, and what I think is I'm gonna use the old rocks as the foundation and the new rocks on top because they have these really nice knobs at the end, they kind of just really fit together nicely. And since they are arches, I'm thinking of doing a more arch theme. But since we're updating the aquascape, I have to think about all the corals that we're gonna put here. Just like that bubble coral. I'm thinking to put it down here in the front, but of course I don't want anything to fall on top of it. So this is kind of my loose idea of what we want to have for the aquascape. And like I said, we're gonna have to kind of put everything in the tank and see where it goes from there, and maybe have to do some tweaks. But right now I'm gonna focus on getting this foundation all cemented together. I think I'm gonna use some epoxy and maybe some super glue and see where we go from there. Instead of gluing everything together, I'm just gonna start with the base. I'm gonna glue these 3 rocks together and then put them in the tank. And then afterwards, I'm gonna stack the other arches on top. To put the rocks together, I have this epoxy putty. And basically, you just wanna see the best parts where the rocks connect. And once you have the most contact, you just kind of put the putty there. And see where it sits in. You might have to add a second piece. And then you can just mold it into place so it kind of disappears. It'll end up looking like coralline algae. Now that I have more or less the idea of what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna pick up these rocks and put them in the tank. And what I've done is I've cut up some egg crate and I'm just gonna add it to the bottom of the tank here. That's gonna be a nice foundation for the rocks. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put the rocks on top of the egg crate first and then add the sand afterwards. So I think we've come up with our final aquascape, and we have some old rocks on the bottom and we have some new rocks on the top, and we haven't put any of the corals in yet because now we're going to fill it with water, and that might take 15-20 minutes, and then we'll place some of the corals in the tank afterwards. It's been a few days now since we finished our update project. And that night when we were adding all the sand and the water, what happens is the water gets pretty cloudy, so there's not much we can show. But what we did is we just put the corals in the tank, let it set overnight, and in the morning when the water cleared up, we just took a few of those corals and placed them where we had originally planned. We put the bubble coral on the side here, he's got his own little space. We put the Montipora in the middle, and the soft corals and the candy canes on the other side. After that, kind of just let everything sit there for the last 2-3 days and just decide where the final placement of those corals is going to be. And we have 2 soft corals that we know exactly where they're going to go, and we're actually going to slot them into those holes that come on those beautiful arches. And I'm going to show you an easy method that you can do that. So I have this Spicularia and a Catanella frag that I know I'm going to want to put on one of the top of the arches. And the frag plugs actually fit nicely into the holes that are in those arches, but they just kind of sit there. And I want to make sure they stay put. And I actually have the perfect thing to do that, which is this Aquavitra Bond. And it's these little plastic pellets. And you just have to put them in hot water. And they melt and form into a little ball. I've poured some before right here, so let's pull it out and see how it goes. So once you've poured the beads into the water, it melts together a little bit. And you can just take it out and play with it a bit until you kind of get the shape that you want. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this coral, this is a nice Catanella, and I'm going to place it around the base of the coral like this, and then we're going to put it in the tank. So here we go, we're just going to put it in the hole there and get a nice hold. Overall, I'm really happy with the results of this project. I just love those carob sea arches. They do such a fantastic job of creating all these open spaces, and I really think my fish appreciate it as well. And I think I've accomplished the #1 goal with this project, which was to leave more open spaces, more real estate for new corals. One of the things I also love about this is when you look at the tank from the side, you can see that there's just so much more space behind the rocks, and I can tell that the flow is just that much better. And now I guess there's really not much else I can do except for observe the corals. So over the next couple of days, that's what I'm going to be doing, is just watching the corals and see where I might want to place them, their final placement. I placed a couple of those soft corals today, but I still have quite a few corals in there that are just sitting on the rocks, waiting for their final home. And at this point of the project, observation is really key, especially to observe your corals and see if any of them got stressed during the move. I know that our Martipora did get stressed, and right now we're just gonna have it in the tank and making sure the parameters stay stable and giving it the best chance it has to recover. But other than that, really everything is fine. All the corals are happy, all the fish are happy, and overall, I just love the way that the new Aquascape looks. So I hope that if you're planning to upgrade your Aquascape, you should just go for it, because you can really get that dream Aquascape that you're looking for. And I hope that you find some tips useful from this video that you can use in your next project. Thanks for watching. Hi everyone. So welcome back. I see what a difference that made to do that update. It took us all weekend. It was a pretty big project, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. And any of you out there that have an Aquascape that maybe you're just not happy with, I mean, there is so many of these new rocks available to us. Those arches are just they're so awesome. They fit together nicely. And so it is possible. It is a lot of work to update your Aquascape like that, but I think in the end, it is definitely worthwhile. And we've been looking at the comments throughout this video, and everyone's pretty much right. I mean, you would think that when we're adding these new rocks to the old rocks, there is a chance, like you were saying, to go through kind of a cycle. But Anya brought up a really good point, which was awareness. I think if you're going to be doing any maintenance or any changes to your aquarium, and this goes for even just adding fish, just be aware of what you're doing. And so when we went through this upgrade, I mean, we were definitely thinking about that, is what's going to happen? Are we going to go through a mini cycle? And so I don't know, Anya, can you tell us some of this awareness about, what to look out for if you're going to be doing an upgrade process like this?
I think just being aware of and understanding that what you're doing is potentially disturbing this biological kind of microbial ecosystem, and there are plenty of products available to mitigate those issues that could potentially arise. But you have to just be, number one, aware that this could happen. You can reseed your bacteria. You can use ammonia absorbing media. You can do a water change to dilute these issues. It just takes a little bit more work, but also awareness. And you don't have to have a tank completely automated to know what's really going on. It doesn't matter how much money you've got. There's definitely a solution for every kind of a budget as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was one of our concerns for sure. I definitely left some old rock in here. I tried to follow like a 60-40 rule. I tried to leave the 60% of the old rocks, and I actually put some in the sump too, just to make sure that I have and maintain that biology. And I really don't have a lot of fish in there, so I wasn't too worried. But one of the other comments we have here is from Chrissy. What challenges have you found disturbing the sand bed of a mature tank? And as I mentioned in that video, this tank was 7 years old when I got it. But that sand was actually only 6 months old, because I set up this tank 6 months old. So I know that if you do disturb the sand, you can definitely dig up some of that biology, and you could run into some troubles. But all in all, I mean, this whole process went pretty well. And a couple tips for you, if you are ever thinking that you might want to upgrade, is be really thoughtful and mindful of when you place your corals. I know those two, that Capnella and the Cispicularia, I know I wanted it on top of that arch, but really everything else isn't glued down yet. And I know, Wendy, that was something that you had mentioned with your tank, is none of your corals are glued down yet. Because
yeah. I really wanted like a zoa garden, so I put all the zoas on one freestanding rock, because potentially with an upgrade I can take that along with me. It's not cemented together or anything like that. With my arches, the torch and the hammer were actually there. Luckily I didn't glue my hammer down, because the torch decided to go over and sting it. So I was able to take that hammer and move it to a safe place, and keep the torch in all of its glory, like at the top. So for me, gluing didn't make a lot of sense for me because I was hoping to move things around or upgrade later on.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing is, like I said, if you're just starting out your tank from scratch and you already know about these great arch rocks from Carib Sea or any other shaped rocks that are available to us, the best thing is to plan your aquascape ahead of time. But you could be like me and adopted a tank, or you could have just set up your tank and not be that happy. So it is something that you might look at doing is upgrading. Let's see. Let's go to the comments because we got some great ones going on here. Lucas H asks, would the addition of some new dry rock cause the tank to go through the ugly stages again? And that goes back to what we were saying about awareness, is like, as long as you're aware, I haven't noticed anything yet. It's very possible that that could happen, but I think we have such an established bacteria with those old rocks that hopefully we can avoid it. A lot of these questions are just about that too. Tommy Teodoro asked, what about the stability mixing the old new rocks? Is it going to have a mini cycle? Dan Swanson, how safe is it to add the new rocks after the tank is cycled? So again, all of these questions are very important, very valid, but as long as you're aware of that beforehand, hopefully you won't go through a cycle, especially with such a big tank like this. People are loving the new setup. Tommy asked also, did you go through an algae bloom after the new tank? And actually, yeah, I did have a little bit of a bacteria outbreak and added some ChemiPure, and it was gone in the next day. So that was lucky. People are loving it here. Nice job in the tank, nice coralline growth. New Aquascape really makes such a difference, and it's true. I don't know about you, but I love it. I think it sparks joy. It makes me happy. I can see, Wendy, that big tank is right in your living room. I'm sure, Anya, you've got plenty of tanks, so we all know it's so important that when you're looking at your tank, it makes you feel happy. Did you have any tips for everyone about aquascaping? One of the things I didn't cover was the placement of the corals, because I know that video is coming next. But overall, do you have any tips, Wendy?
No, just not off the top of my head. I'm just happy with my setup as far as making sure I have a different placement and the corals are where they're happiest, and I'm able to kind of move them around need be if when I'm ready to upgrade, or even around the tank to help find better light parameters and things like that. So I'm a habit. I love change. So it's probably
Do you have
that
any
suits
corals
me.
stuck down?
I'm sorry.
Do you have any corals glued to the rocks?
I do have just the zoas on the one rock that I can move around, and then I do have a branching frog spawn that I did actually take off. And this is my first experience and first time gluing any type of animal to any rock. So that was.
Okay. I think that's a good tip too. Corals like Xenia that spread a lot, make sure to put it on, or green star polyp or zoanthids, stick it to one rock that you can move the rock. And Anya, I know, do you have any tips for us about aquascaping or any of your favorite rocks?
We heavily endorse the Carib Sea shapes. We also really enjoy the Marco rock, but we've also got a big bin with the real reef rock. So we kind of try and it depends. Some people really want that purple coralline kind of look instantaneously, and then others really like to see that evidence of it developing over time. But I think when you think about the modern aquascaping kind of trends, it used to be just this big hunky rock wall, but now people have more understanding of the importance of flow and having like a more minimal footprint on the substrate or on the base. And so I think negative space speaks volumes as well when it comes to like design. I would just pull a tip from art class, which is a rule of thirds.
Right.
And I find that when people are using, whether it's subconsciously or not, the rule of thirds works very, very well visually. And you know, it definitely sparks joy.
Yeah, I mean, I was really kind of like stuck with this aquascape because before adding these new rocks, I really just had cannonballs. And one of the things I said in the video is my old aquascape was really just a precarious rock pile. And at any moment you could risk an avalanche. And I think a lot of people, they get those live rocks either from their local fish store or they've got it from a friend, and there's only so much you can do with a pile of big chunky cannonball rocks. So I was kind of limited. I would actually like to have less rocks in my tank, but there was that balance. less yeah, I want more negative space. But
And everything. I mean, it just created so much more dimension, really, and
Yeah.
just utilizing your entire aquarium is
Right.
something I personally like. Sometimes I see these tall tanks with this low, very low scape, and they aren't planning to grow branching coral in the gap. And I'm like, come on, like utilize the whole canvas, you know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other thing. You know, just taking advantage of all those things about the flow. We've got great flow in the tank now. Before, again, it was like you said, a rock wall, a rock cannonball, pile of rocks, and now it is a beautiful, flowing, free-flowing aquascape. I can't wait to get a smaller little power head in there so I can really get some flow going in the back of the tank. And the fish definitely love it. They have more space. And you know what I've noticed with this new aquascape? All the shrimp are just, they have less places to hide. Yeah, they're more out in the front. Before they were all hiding under the rocks. So we got a couple questions, and yeah, tell me, Anya.
No, that's a really good point. I always think about fish. That's right. That's right. I'm so heavily obsessed with coral. I forget that people have fish.
The fish are a part of it too.
Right. You know, I said in the video, we need, with the new aquascape, I have hiding places and open spaces. And
Yes,
I've definitely created some more real estate for myself. I've held off on getting new corals until I knew I was going to finish this upgrade process, because one of the things I'm going to do is add these dosing pumps and really trying to go more heavily on corals. So hopefully here in the next couple of months, we're really going to see quite this transformation. But
you have mature like pieces of coral too, whereas someone like me, I started off with a lot smaller frags, so you definitely work with that space really well.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are like you too, Wendy, is that they just start a tank, or people watching as well, is that they start a tank and they get little frags and then grow them out. And I went with I'm going to adopt this tank route, which some people do too. I mean, that's a great way to get into the hobby, and you can feel good about it, you know, or adopt the corals. We've got some questions, comments in the chat here. Rogue Aquarium says, sometimes when aquascaping a tank, less is more. And I think we can all agree about that. We got a Fibonacci for the win, which is another form of, it's a more advanced form of the rule of thirds. We got hit the rock with a hammer. That's a good way to break apart the rocks if you need to. I think he was talking about how to add coralline to your algae. Cycling with rocks first would be an option. Yeah, you can definitely do that. If you have dry rocks, you're going to want to start out your aquascape cycling with the dry rocks. Blue Reef asked, nice job. How old is your tank? Coralline growth is amazing. This tank was 7 years old when I got it. And the aquarist who had it before me, I'm pretty sure he just left his hands out of the tank and he was able to grow some really nice corals. So I think it shows us all less is more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looks pretty good. So I think, yeah, one of the things I didn't cover in that video was the placement of the corals, which is really important in the aquascape. Some of the tips that we made was we want to have better flow. We want more space for our corals, and we want it to be aesthetics. But I held off on the nitty gritty of where to place the corals, because our next guest is Krista from Krista and Paige Aquaculture. They own a business down in Washington State. And what's really awesome about this experience at ReefStock is I got to hang out with Anya and Wendy, who are my good friends. And ReefStock is all about connecting with your community and connecting with your friends, but it's also about meeting new people. And Krista is someone that I just met, and she's got a great video for us coming up next about how to keep your corals happy and healthy in your tank.
Hey everyone, my name is Krista, and I'm Paige from K&P Aquaculture. So now that your tank has been chosen, your aquascape has been set up, and your water has been tested, you can add some corals. So when you're doing this, you want to be able to create a suitable environment for them. This means you're making sure you have plenty of good flow with no dead spots, keeping your temperature stable between 77 to 79 degrees, and making sure that you have plenty of rock for your bio load.
We highly recommend starting off with soft corals as they do tend to be a lot more hardier.
This can be zoas, leathers, and mushrooms.
So I don't know about you, but one thing I wish I would have known when I first started was how the corals I first added were going to grow in my tank.
Certain coral types spread quickly, such as the green star polyps, also known as GSP, pulsing xenia, and the Kenya tree, just to name a few. Corals will literally go to chemical war as they compete for space. For this reason, it's important to know how fast growing a coral is before adding to your tank. When corals compete for space, they release toxins that can harm other corals, so we run carbon in our tanks to absorb these.
Many of these soft corals
Like zoas, leathers, GSP, and xenia,
can handle different amount of light and flow, making it easy for placement in your tank.
Mushrooms and cloves, on the other hand, prefer low lighting and low flow. For those who know their PAR level, this is usually between 80 to 150.
Mushrooms are one of my favorite corals. They are hardy and, depending on the species, can be fast or slow growers.
This is good to keep in mind as some species can take over your rockwork as well.
adding soft corals when beginning will help establish a stable environment, absorbing nutrients to help keep the tank balanced.
Now that you've added some soft corals, if you're anything like me, you're ready to add more. So let's talk about anemones.
Anemones can include rock flowers, condylactis, long tentacles, carpets, sea bays, and even bubble tips. Condylactis are good anemones for beginners, but they are rarely hosted by clownfish. Long tentacles and sea bays often prefer the sandbed and should be kept at least 3 to 5 inches away from other corals. Many species, especially carpets, will also eat fish if one gets too close. I often advise against adding these species if you plan to keep small fish or a lot of corals. Rock flowers and bubble tip anemones are a fun add. Rock flowers don't move around as much as some other species and often prefer low light and low to medium flow. I have had them in many nano reef tanks, but it should be known that they can get a decent size and they will sting corals around them. Bubble tips can move around, but I've noticed most prefer higher light and high flow, par between 150 to 250. There are hundreds of variations in color among the green, rose, and rainbow bubble tips. Some even have lineage, such as the Black Widow, Sherman Rose Bubble, and the highly prized Chicago and Colorado Sunbursts.
We personally prefer to add our bubble tip anemones in before we start adding too many corals. That way we can get an idea of where they're going to settle down and then work around them.
We also recommend turning off your power heads until your anemone has a chance to get its foot attached to the rockwork. That way it doesn't get shredded in the power head.
If this happens, remove quickly and add carbon to help remove any toxins that could possibly harm your corals.
So, as you plan on getting more into advanced corals, this is where lighting becomes very important, and I really recommend not going cheap if you plan to grow more than soft corals or anemones.
If you have access to a PAR meter, we try to keep our PAR roughly 100 to 250 from bottom to top.
In our own growouts, we are using LEDs and T5 Blue Plus and Coral Plus bulbs. If you are unsure if your lighting is adequate enough, you can always go to your local fish store to rent or buy a PAR meter. This will give you a better idea of coral placement in the future instead of guessing.
Now that your lighting is good and corals are doing well, you probably find yourself wanting to add large polyp stony-based corals, also known as LPS. While there are many options out there, some are harder to care for than others.
Hammers, acans, candy canes, and blastos are great species to start with. These are hardier and come in many varieties and colors depending on the budget. Hammers and frog spawn are part of the Euphyllia family and come in 2 types, branching and wall forms. Branching will separate into single heads as they grow and are easier to keep with higher chances of survival. Wall hammers and wall frog spawn grow as one head, being difficult to cut and are very sensitive to changes in parameters. These generally prefer moderate lighting and moderate flow, with PAR between 100 to 200. Elegants make beautiful showpiece corals, but they're difficult to cut and they can grow quite large, eating the occasional fish who swims too close.
Now I'm sure by this point you had your eye on some of those Indo and Aussie torches. While they are trickier than hammers and frog spawn, their long flowing tentacles can show off some beautiful mesmerizing colors.
Torches prefer moderate light as well, but they often prefer a little bit more flow than other Euphyllia. Their tentacles can often stretch out, so give them space from other corals, especially when they stretch out at night to feed. The torches are notorious for brown jelly disease. While other corals are prone to this, it seems that they always affect our torches the most.
If you notice brown, goopy, jelly-like substance forming around any of your corals, an iodine dip is a must.
So brown jelly is actually caused from a bacteria that causes infection and tissue necrosis. Once this happens, remove the coral carefully from the tank to avoid the brown jelly from spreading, and cut the coral if possible to remove the damaged area. Dip in an iodine solution with water from the tank for 2 to 3 minutes, swishing gently around, and either place back in the tank or in a quarantine tank if you have one set up.
If your tank can handle torches, it's ready for some other corals with movement. Some of my favorites are alveoporas and gonioporas. These can be distinguished from one another by counting the number of petals they have. Alveopora have 12 petals, while gonies have 24. These often do best in low light, often on the sand bed or lower rockwork.
These are personally my favorite corals, and they love to be fed. Speaking of feeding our corals, we're actually feeding our own homegrown phytoplankton broadcasts every day and powdered coral food with probiotics every 2 days. The probiotics actually help to keep the phosphates down.
It is important to keep phosphates under 0.05 for best growth and coloration of corals. Most of our LPS and soft corals prefer slightly dirtier water, meaning nitrates are around 10 to 20 parts per million.
So we never want our nutrients to be too low, otherwise our corals could starve, but too high and they could die or get overtaken with algae and die. But consistency really is key. If your nutrients is imbalanced, it can also cause a number of issues such as dinoflagellates and cyano.
Dinos often look like brown bubbly strings that show up on the sand and rock. It can strip the oxygen out of your tank, harming fish and corals. Cyano is usually from high excess amounts of nutrients that haven't been absorbed. It's often maroon, red, or green in coloration and can be a nuisance to coral.
While there are lots of treatments, both chemical and natural, for these issues, it is important to find the source of the issue to keep it from occurring.
After about 6 months is usually when I start to add some of the trickier corals. Chalices, being another favorite of mine, prefer low light and moderate flow. They are very sensitive to swings and parameters. Looking to fill in some of those low-lit areas, encrusting corals like Favias, Leptoceras, Goniastrias, and Favites will spread over the shape of your rocks. Lobos and Scolies are usually very slow growers and will take many years to grow out. Many not changing shape, only size. These corals come in crazy bright variations as well.
So around this time is usually when we begin to add the SPS corals, or the small polyp stony base corals. These usually thrive in areas near the top where your light and flow is highest.
Some Montes will encrust while others are plating, growing out in fan-like shapes out across the tank. Acros can grow up, branching out like a tree, or tabling, growing outwards rather than up. When I'm first introducing SPS to my tank, I like to start off with hardier ones such as Postylopora, Stylopora, Sponge Goaty, the Garf Bonsai, and the Digitata. These have all done really well for me. The torts have also done well for me, such as the Miyagi, California, and Oregon torts.
So as you begin to add more stony corals, you will notice your alkalinity and your calcium is dropping despite doing water changes. This is when the water changes aren't enough to replenish what the corals are absorbing.
While there are some who hand dose, I strongly recommend getting a dosing pump. It allows for consistency and better stability. Many brands recommend dosing these additives several hours apart.
Lastly, what we want to leave you with is this. What might work for you might not work for another reefer, so please don't get discouraged.
From our personal experiences, we found that the key to having a successful reef tank overall is stability and consistency.
Hi, Krista. Thank you for joining us today. And what a great video you just shared with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Yeah, like I was saying, it's great to meet new people. And I love that video you gave us about the corals. There's really some great tips in there. And while we were watching that video, I was going through some of the comments here. We've got a lot more people showing up. We've got someone from Brazil in the house, which is awesome. And we've got a lot of people talking about maybe we should have a, they're enjoying our hosting, they're enjoying our show. And that is so awesome to see. We've got some comments here about anemones and Euphilia corals. So let's just get started with, today the theme is obviously success with your first reef tank. And we know we've got some people starting out. So let's just talk about, first of all, like what are some of the corals that you would recommend to the new hobbyists out there?
So definitely when you're starting out, I love mushrooms. They add a lot of color. They're very easy, hardy to start with. Some species, it is kind of good to keep in mind, and I did touch up on this a little bit in the video, that it can overtake your rocks. This being like Ricordia's Yumas are famous for that. I love them. They're fun. Just kind of keep that in mind. I remember I started off with a 14 gallon, and added in a Yuma and it took over that whole rock and stung most of the corals I tried to add just because of how little space that I had in there. But mushrooms are great. Zoas are great. Xenia, GSPR, just know that they can grow like a weed. So isolating it usually on the sand bed's a good idea.
That's awesome. Yeah, I actually have a comment in here. Someone says they're not an anemone guy, but they do love the rock flower anemones. And I also do. They're so pretty, you know, those rock flower anemones. Someone says they love anemones. They have 2 black widows from the original lineage and 3 sunbursts, sorry. I know a lot of people love anemones, and that's something you touched on. And yeah, mushrooms are great. I have a lot of mushrooms in my tank, Recordias. And then it seems that next people really want to move up to that bigger anemone. So what are some tips you have for people that are looking to get that anemone in their tank? And what are some of the parameters that they should wait for before they add one?
Well, I do know it really depends on the anemone. Some of my smaller nano tanks, I've actually put rock flowers in. I usually like to turn off the power head and flow just temporarily, you know, like roughly 20, 25 minutes, just however long it takes them to kind of get their foot in and settled in. They may move around just a little bit to make themselves happy, but they generally don't move around as much as some of the other ones. I do tend to avoid usually the other types of anemones, like I mentioned in my video, just because they're not always the most coral or fish friendly. But bubble tips have always been really good ads for me. I always, again, turn off the power heads, turn off the flow. You can add carbon. It's always kind of a safe bet to do. That way it will pull any of that toxicities in the tank that it can add in there. And one thing I really like to do, because anemones are hardier, I actually like to start them off before I add too many corals. Right. That way I can kind of get an idea where they settle in and then you kind of work around them.
Yeah, and I know in my video I showed actually placing one of those soft corals, and one of the comments and questions we get from people when they're adding mushrooms and they're adding flower anemones, they think some people try to glue them to the rocks, and actually these animals, they just attach themselves. And so like you said, you kind of got to put them in and kind of they choose. You don't get to choose. So for any of you new hobbyists out there, yeah, don't try to glue down your mushrooms because probably won't work.
Leathers will do the same thing.
What's that?
I said leathers will also do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think my leather corals were already attached to some rocks, but let's hope they can stay put. Chris C in the comment says activated carbon is a lifesaver after going after a rogue anemone. Always have it on hand, which is a great tip. So I love mushrooms. Paige Heath says, I love mushrooms. I love mushrooms too. What about Sean Davies has a great question here. Maybe you can answer. Is there a minimum par requirement for a bubble tip anemone?
I mean, I think the lowest I've ever gone was around 100, and that was really pushing it. It didn't really get as many of the colors that I was really hoping for. In the one video that I showed, it's a 32 biocube that has several species of bubble tips in there. I'm hitting about 175. So it's a little bit lower, but I do really like the colors coming out of it.
And once you find that there's hobbyists that are having success with their reef tank and they're growing mushrooms and everything is looking great, what's the next step that you would tell people? What are some of those next corals that they would want to add to their tank?
So that's usually when I get more into those LPS corals. I really like to start off with, like I mentioned, the candy canes, hammers. Acans are always a pretty good hardy one, and they're fun. So they add a little bit more variety to the tank because you can also feed them as you get more into them, like Scully, Lobo, corals. Those are really fun. You can get more into the feeding. I think that's more the addictive part for me. Seeing all those polyps and tentacles extend to try and feed on them. Then torches are definitely one of those that I love to add. But I always like to wait, see how the hammers and the frog spawn do first, just because the torches can get a little pricier.
Yeah, there's some really beautiful ones out there. And I see someone has commented that hammers and the frog spawns are no longer Euphilia. They're actually a Fimbriophilia. And as you mentioned, the torch corals stayed in Euphilia, and those can really sting all your other corals. So yes. I think a good tip too is when you're placing your corals to know that and give them a wide berth, give them their own space. They need space. We got some other questions here. After that, actually, yeah, I got some nice, we got a comment earlier, someone commenting on my beautiful candy cane corals. I love those corals, and I'm with you. I love to feed them. And actually yesterday I have some questions that came in from Instagram, and It's all about corals is wondering, what are the best nitrates and the phosphates level for setting up a mixed reef?
So I've really found if you can, I know phosphates are hard to keep down. If you can keep them under 0.05, that seems to be where I get the best growth and coloration. As far as nitrates go, I actually run my water a little dirtier than most people. Mine's kind of pushing 20 parts per million, but usually anywhere if you keep it between 10 to 20, you should do fairly well. Your corals will still be happy. They won't starve, but they also won't have excessive nutrients in your tank.
Yeah, I know that's always such a conversation starter because everyone has different opinions on where to go with this. And I think this just comes back to everything that we've been talking throughout the whole episode is the key to all of this. The key to success is observation and patience and knowing what works best for your tank.
Yes.
And I think I'm kind of at that next stage too, where my tank has a lot of mushrooms, has a lot of LPS corals. And what advice would you give to me or to anyone watching? How do we know when we're ready for those SPS corals, and what can we do to make sure those stay happy in our tank?
So while there are people who do try to add them in a little earlier, I usually like to wait about 6 months, like you guys had mentioned previously, just to wait till that tank is a little bit more mature. It tends to just do better. Your parameters stay a little more stable. So then you can kind of get into more of those finicky corals. And that's where I really like, chalices are LPS corals, but they are a little more finicky like SPS. They're really beautiful. They go in low light. They're one of my favorites to add. And of course, SPS are just an addiction once you start getting into those. The colors and the growth are just phenomenal. You're definitely impatient, then acros are one for you. But yeah, usually I like to wait until that 6 month mark, make sure that my parameters are really stable. I'm doing a lot of testing in those beginning stages, but then after everything starts to stabilize, it's a lot less testing. I think I'm only doing like once a week, twice a week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely at that point in my tank. I know we just did this big upgrade and I actually drilled the tank, put an overflow and a sump. And it was quite a lot to add to video. And so I'm really going to be hitting that next step soon when I'm looking for the more stable tank. I'm going to be setting up these dosing pumps and really working on that stability because I find, it's pretty tricky without a dosing pump to keep things stable. And I think my SPS the one SPS Montipora that I have, it's suffering a little bit. I think it's hanging on, and we're gonna give it the best chance for survival. I know you're mentioning that I could dip my coral, but we're just gonna leave it in there right now. Leave everything stable, and hopefully it pulls through. Let's just get to the comments here. Blue Reef has a question. How did we get into the hobby? That's a great question. I started working for Reef Builders 4 or 5 years ago, and I got into the hobby that way. What about you, Krista? How did you get into the hobby?
It was actually a little ironic. I was actually going into marine conservation, coral protection in Hawaii, and my girlfriend's from Washington, and we ended up moving here. And I ended up working for Point Defiant Zoo and Aquarium, if you've heard of that place. Got to be a part of opening that new zoo or the new aquarium building. And through that, they had a bunch of corals and they're all kind of behind the scenes. And none of them really knew a lot of like how to grow corals. They had been mostly focusing on fish. And I started working for a local fish store. And that's when I started diving more into the hobbyist side of it. And I realized it's actually a huge industry. It's really fun. The people here, they all love connecting and getting together, chatting about corals. And it became a quick addiction. So I've been into the hobby side of it for about 3 years now.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, that's what ReefStock is all about, is all about bringing people together. And this is such a great format. Like I was saying before, everyone's really enjoying this ReefStock at home because part of it is a hobby and part of it's connecting and chatting and learning from each other. So it's really great to have you here and to be able to answer some of these questions. I know someone in the comments says that you're doing a great job, Krista, and I keep asking all the questions that they were about to ask. So I think let's see if we have any more questions in the chat here from people wanting to know how to grow your corals. You have me and Krista here to answer them, and how you can be successful. Did you have any more tips that you want to share with us? Maybe you mentioned in the end about lighting and about measuring your par meter. I think this is a little bit more of a, getting past that first step. But I think let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it does seem really overwhelming at first, especially as I started getting into the par. I was like, whoa, lighting is way too complicated. But really, once you start getting more into it and you start learning like different corals and what they prefer, like where some are low light, some are high light, some kind of like that medium light. It's more of a guessing game in the beginning. It was kind of a, oh, I wonder what the par level is here. I hope this coral will do well. You kind of wait a week or two, see how the coral does, and if it's not doing well, you usually have to move it. Whereas when I rent a par meter or I kind of have an idea, I actually like to take a picture of the tank, and then I will measure the different levels in different areas of the tank and kind of write it down and record it. That way I always have it as a reference. And that way, once you start getting into corals and even some species that you aren't as familiar with, you can kind of do a little bit of research on it, find out what kind of lighting it likes. Usually somewhere in that moderate range is like 150 to 200. A higher light is anywhere between 200. Some people run really high. I don't like to go over 250. I have heard people who have like acros go up as high as like 500. I would imagine that the acclimation period is a little longer for that. I like keeping mine around 250 just because when I do buy like SPS from the local fish stores, they usually tend to acclimate a little faster and do pretty well. They don't usually lose their color. And then as those low light corals, anywhere between like 80 to 100, cloves, mushrooms, chalices, they all really love those.
You know, that's a great point too, is I think when people are first getting started, is that we have to remember that corals are animals. And so they all have their specific habitat where they want to live, whether that mean high light or high flow, low light. So it's really good to consider those things when we're placing these animals in our tank. And luckily there's a lot of great resources available online where you can find out this information and make sure that your corals are getting the optimal conditions. And like you said, we can just place them in there and guess into the guessing game. But there are those tools available to us, like a par meter, which you can often rent from your local fish store to get more detailed, in-depth readings, you know? We got a couple more questions in the chat. And then I think we're going to end up. We have Che Steve asks, what's your favorite coral and why? I personally love Cyphastria and all those little encrusting corals. What about you, Krista?
I do like chalices, as I mentioned. Mushrooms are another favorite one, and then torches. Torches by far, I just have a soft spot for them, especially the Indo ones that have been coming out lately.
Right.
The flow, and we have one of our tanks dialed in, I would say like perfectly, knock on wood. But where that torch is just, it has perfect momentum, really nice extended tentacles. It's just addicting. I want to collect them all.
I know. And I think just to tie this all in with the beginning of the show here, when we were talking about choosing your different tank sizes, I have a comment in here about a mixed reef. And we're throwing around a lot of terms here about SPS, LPS, mixed reef. And I think that's really important to consider when you're setting up your tank from the beginning. Do your research and find out what are the corals and the animals that really make you the happiest. Find which corals are your favorite. And then, you know, you're going to really have to adapt and build your aquascape around that. You wouldn't want to go throw a bunch of torch corals next to some acroporas because, well, torch is probably going to win.
Oh, yeah.
So it's good to research that ahead of time. I think, you know, a lot of people are loving this conversation, and it's so great to meet people like you and to have you on the show and to be able to give this advice to new hobbyists, because I think a lot of times, you know, people they just go to their fish store, pick up what they like and put it in their tank. And then we're trying to get people past that first step of guessing and into the road of success, because we all want to see everyone having those amazing tanks. Someone's asking about the tank behind you. What size of tank is that?
This is the Reefer 250, so it's about 54 gallons.
Great. And they're also asking.
No, it's this one. I have another tank, which is the Reefer 170 on the other side of the room.
Oh, that's a nice size. I only have a 90 gallon, but I would like to get a bigger one.
I have 18 saltwater tanks in my house currently.
That's dedication. That's commitment. But that's awesome. I love to get advice from people who are actually keeping aquariums and real reefers that have real knowledge for everyone to share. So thanks for all this great knowledge and that great video that you shared with us. And thank you for coming along today to ReefStock at Home.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys having me a part of this.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, thank you everyone who tuned in today. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode of ReefStock at Home, success with your first reef tank. What this is all about is really to get you past that first stage and to introduce you to the hobby, introduce you to the community, the reef aquarium community. We're all here for you. We're here to answer your questions, and we really want to make sure that you succeed and that you have a happy, healthy, thriving tank well into the future. So tune in next time when we do ReefStock at home next month, and make sure to stay tuned and ask your questions in the comments, and we'll always be there to answer them for you. So thanks for tuning in. And of course, I know that you've all stayed here till the end, and we are here to do our extra special prize giveaways. We have the Ecotech Radion lights to give away and the Aqua Vitro Division protein skimmers to give away. So thank you, Dan Swanson, Tom Teodoro, Mark Knight, Jody Hadlock, and Blue Reef. You are the winners of our giveaway. Make sure to give us a call, not give us a call, shoot me an email, and we'll get those prizes out to you. Thank you so much for staying in the comments, staying engaged, chatting, and asking your questions. We really appreciate it. And we really hope that you enjoyed this episode. And thank you everyone for tuning in today.